Hi, I'm AJ O'Neill, and I'm about to tell you why I go on a rampage every time I talk about this subject. So, a module pattern that works everywhere for JavaScript. Why is it so complicated? Because no standard is complete without screwing up the way we already do things. Okay? So, first of all, this is the pattern. And yes, that is the pattern. This is the only way to write a module that is going to be able to work in the browser as well as in CommonJS and in Node.js and with package managed systems, etc., 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 etc. Okay, why this drives me nuts, other than that it looks freaking ugly? Oh, and if you think that's the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen in your life, you're a JavaScript noob, because there's even worse stuff. Alright, so let's talk about the problem from the beginning. Script tags. Script tags, worst idea ever. So everything's global all the time. Just global, 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 global. For some reason, we couldn't have file level scope in JavaScript. So what people did when they got smart was they started doing things like this, where you check to see if window.foo exists before you override it, or you assign it to an old foo, and then you provide some sort of no conflict function, and that's how JSON.js and jQuery do it, kind of like that. Then the next evolution, as far as what I've seen, was jQuery plugins, but they just kind of work with jQuery, and they're not really a module system, and it's kind of like every noob and their brother writes something and then attaches it to jQuery and calls it a jQuery plugin without even actually following the framework. I know, because that's what I used to do. If you check out my first couple jQuery plugins, they were not actually plugins at all. Then CommonJS modules, which look promising. But here's the thing. CommonJS stems from the fact that server-side JavaScript has been around as long as browser-side JavaScript. A lot of people don't know that, but the Netscape engine that they created way back in the day ran on the server as well. And then other engines came out like Rhino and Ringo and a lot of other things that people really haven't heard about because Node.js rose to the top there. There's also one that was almost popular called Jaxer by Aptana. And yeah, so and then Narwhal, there's got to be a dozen or so of these platforms that came out. And CommonJS was kind of like, well, how do we define JavaScript on the server side? But they didn't consider the browser side. And I don't know what they were smoking or drinking, but the way they implemented CommonJS, there's no way to fudge it in the browser at runtime. Like with ES5, almost everything that's been added to the browser in ES5 you can fudge by extending the prototype of something or writing a new function. It can all be done non-natively, but the CommonJS module system, primarily because it has a require but it lacks a provide, can't be implemented at runtime. It can only be implemented with a package manager or natively inside of the system. But it definitely looks pretty nice, and I even like it a little bit better than Python in the fact that when you import a module, you have to assign it to something. It doesn't just assume a place in the scope, which both Ruby and Python do. And makes it really confusing because you have to look up the documentation more often. I think the nice thing about what they've done with the CommonJS module that is really great is that you don't have to look up documentation as often because you require something, you assign it to something, and you can console.logObject.keys on it to be able to tell what it provides without looking at another source. So here's a CommonJS module. You can do just exports.foo equals foo, or you can do foo equals exports. That's a pattern I've seen quite often. But you can't overwrite the reference to exports. And there's not an easy way that looks pretty to detect whether or not there's exports. The only way I know of is just to check if undefined is type of exports, which some linters will complain about that because you're checking the type of something that isn't defined. So you know it's not as beautiful as it could be, and it just the specification is kind of missing some things, which Node.js corrects, because Node.js was just not just theoretical, but an actual implementation of something that was getting off the ground. And maybe some of that other stuff before Node.js was getting off the ground too. I mean, I guess it's like the confluence of factors, and then one rises to the top. But Node.js definitely does it best. I just wish that they had like an optional provide function built in. That would be like the best ever. And really the only change that's needed from the current system to really, really make it nice, other than that it'd be cool if there was some way to test for module or exports other than the type of undefined thing. So anyway, one great thing about the way that Node.js does it is that you can check if require.main is the same as module, and then you can run some main function. So you can require it as a module. One file can be required as a module or can be run as an executable. And I think that's way cool. They also have some stuff where you can kind of detect a parent-child relationship. I don't know if that's actually still valid, and I don't use it. I think it's probably more of an anti-pattern, but maybe that's just because I haven't found a really good use case for it. And of course, exports can be a function, so that's great. Kind of made a typo here, but that should be like function foo or whatever to demonstrate the point, because obviously foo is undefined there. Downside is I don't think that it's been adopted by CommonJS. I think they've kind of stuck with their way that they've got it. And then there's RequireJS, which I'm a bit ignorant of. I keep on saying I'm going to look into it, and then I don't, because I just come up with other solutions that make more sense than what other people have told me about RequireJS. Nice thing about it, it's designed for both server-side and browser-side. The reason I say it's a bit over-engineered is just because it doesn't really make sense to load modules asynchronously. If you've got a module, then the file you want to read in synchronously. You might want to have like a load method or something in that module. Oh, excuse me. It's like 1 in the morning, so whatever. So that if that module does have to do something that can't be done synchronously, that it's easy to do. But the thing with asynchronous is you want asynchronous because when your process is running, you don't want it to be blocking. But when something's loading, it actually makes sense for it to be synchronous because it's going to be faster, potentially given the circumstances or whatever. But it makes sense for you to require something and it to be synchronous, and particularly in the browser, it makes sense for everything to be packaged together, not to be requiring this file and then that file and then that file and that file. Although, I mean, there's cases for everything where it's useful. Any pattern or every pattern exists because somebody's found it useful for something. But I don't really see it. And the sad thing is, because I think RequireJS could be really great from what I've heard, even though I haven't had a lot of any hands-on experience. I've just looked at the examples. But I really think it's a pity that it wasn't adopted by the Node.js community. I guess it's good that there's not two standards where some people create modules of one type, some people create modules of the other type. But if you could mix the Node.js module and the RequireJS module, I think you'd have the best of both worlds, or of all worlds. And I don't know, maybe it's still the best solution. But then there's the problem of accessing the global, and this takes place. So you're in the browser, you don't want to use a package manager, you want somebody to be able to just pick up your file and run with it. Well, you can't use window because that assumes that you're in a browser. You can't use global because that assumes that you're Node.js or perhaps another environment. If you use this, I personally want to slaughter you, because having written a package manager, if people are expecting this to be window, it's just dumb. You should not assume that this is the global. I mean, I think that either assuming window or global is better than assuming this, especially because it doesn't work in strict mode, and then as soon as you wrap it in a function, it loses its thisness. And then this one, I think it might work, this 42 eval. It's talked about in the previous thing I gave. If you, well, shown at least, if you provide an indirect reference to eval, then you can execute it in a non-strict mode, even in a strict context. But really, the golden winner here that works in every environment, whether in strict mode or not, whatever you're doing, guaranteed to give you the right thing, is if you do var global equals new function, return this. And of course that has to be wrapped in a function. Otherwise, if you have something already called global in that scope, then well, the results may not be what you were hoping for. So it does need to be wrapped in that application or pattern. So again, just taking a look at this pattern, now you can kind of see what's going on here. If exports is defined, then we're either in a package manager or an environment that supports CommonJS. Otherwise, we get the global that's guaranteed to be the global without making any assumptions, and then that gets passed in as exports. So if you're in the browser and you did window.foo, you would get foo. If you're in something else and you do require, whatever the name of this file is, .foo, you would get that foo. It's a little bit verbose. To be honest, I don't like it, but it is a pattern that will work. And I've started using it in some cases where I think I've got a good module that I would want people to be able to use without a package manager, just because there's not really a clear winner. I think RequireJS is closest. I think Pack Manager is better, but I haven't really promoted it or anything, and it definitely needs some work on the CLI tools. So in the meantime, this works all right. And the 98 and 3/4% guaranteed is a Dr. Seuss reference, in case you didn't know. But the big problem here is that you're still limited to a single file, which means you still need to have some sort of pre-build process, which means I'd still recommend probably RequireJS or Pack Manager. I'm not sure if RequireJS can handle local file resolves, but Pack Manager definitely does. The reason I built Pack Manager was because I was using Ender, and Ender has some weird problems with where the dependency chain doesn't get resolved quite right, and then it can't do local requires. And then wrap-up, I think, is more similar to Pack Manager, but it's actually, I think, more similar to Pacman, which is the API that Pack Manager is built on. Pack Manager is really just the CLI. And then there's BPM, Browser Package Manager. Haven't ever used it, but Pack Manager is built to work with NPM. I believe RequireJS is. Somebody can correct me on that if I'm wrong. Ender definitely is, and wrap-up is not. Okay, so bad alternatives: not using a build system, continuing to write modules that assume one or the other. And of course, there's going to be subsections of your code that do need to assume one or the other, but I think the MVC pattern should be applied, or whatever you want to call it, because people come up with new names for that pattern all the time. But the model view controller, the part where you separate your logic from your underlying implementation or your UI or your like web requests can easily be abstracted whether using Node or the browser. If you've got something that relies on a web request, just if you're not going to use something that already is abstracted, like abstract HTTP request, which I'm not saying is the best, that still needs quite a bit of work, but you can just write a function that either calls one or the other, and abstract that out from, so that you've got your core logic separate from your nitty-gritty implementation details that are platform specific. Using a non-CommonJS build system, really dumb idea, really annoying, really hard when you want to take somebody else's stuff and then package it. Especially when it assumes things like this is the global. And then any build system that's just going to make it harder or doesn't play well with existing build systems. The nice thing about these is they're all kind of following a general pattern. Their implementation details are a little bit different, but they kind of build upon each other. It's that confluence that some package manager sometimes is going to rise up. That works well with Node and with the browser. And of course, the alternatives to using a package manager are use the module pattern. It works. You can't do multiple files. You have to stick everything in one big file, which I think is a bad idea if you're looking at doing a 1,200 line file. You can provide to your end user a pre-built dist release. So you build it with CommonJS. You run Ender or Pack Manager or RequireJS or whatever on it to produce the file that's needed, and then release that. And Pack Manager kind of does it all. So, like I said, the CLI tools aren't quite as pretty as they ought to be, but the dang thing works, and it works well. So what do? Most of the time I don't use the module pattern that works everywhere. Instead, I just use the Node.js module pattern. I package it with Pack Manager, I distribute it through NPM, and it works. So I try to keep it on the module end stupid simple. Just follow the basic conventions. But if you want to use the module pattern, that's why I'm telling you about it, because it's there. Okay, have a great night.